Thank you so much for this kind words and this kind introduction. I'm very glad and honored to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to listen to your comments after my presentation here. I will start with some words about the scholarly context, about me and my research group, my research environment. And as we heard, I'm a historian from Lund University. I have published 2 monographs so far. The first one was my dissertation, Sweden After Nazism, which I eventually turned into a book that was about the experiences of Nazism in the wake of the Second World War, and how Sweden at that time was very much influenced by these experiences, shifting from a much German-oriented culture sphere towards the Anglo-Saxon world. That hadn't really much to do with knowledge, history of knowledge, but it belongs to my background. My second book, published last year with Manchester, is about the Humboldtian tradition. That is really my postdoctoral research. And that is available open access if you have an interest in German intellectual history, history of the university. And that was really something that started me, or began started my interest in how to write a history of knowledge in a much broader sense than just intellectual history. At that time, I was in Berlin at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and I was then very much influenced by the contemporary German discussions about how to broaden the history of science, going away from what the Germans call Wissenschaftsgeschichte to a broader Wissensgeschichte. That is a history of knowledge in a more broader sense. And then I returned to Lund and formed, together with various colleagues, a Nordic network based mainly in Lund, but also with good connections to Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And a couple of years ago, we launched our website, newhistoryofknowledge.com, and there you can find information about our research group, our research environment at Lund, but also our publications, our Nordic networks, and international connections. At Lund, we are some 12 scholars, I would say, 11, 12 scholars devoted to the history of knowledge. We have different empirical and chronological focus, but we have a shared interest in developing the history of knowledge, its methods, its theories, its frameworks. And this is what we are building, and it's mainly early career scholars working with this. But it's a big interest, I would say, and also we experience that with other colleagues around the world. In this presentation today, I will start by introducing briefly what I understand with the concept of history of knowledge, and I will do that by presenting different understandings of the field, what I have recognized reading the literature, 5 major or main understandings of the field. After this historiographical overview, I will turn into what is the main point here, or my main part of the lecture, which is my new project about how to write a new history of the post-war humanities, and how that could be linked or seen as a part of a larger enterprise of the history of knowledge. So I will start with a more general outline. The history of knowledge belongs to the 21st century. Even though knowledge in its various manifestations has been studied within a wide range of historical disciplines for decades, if not for centuries, the history of knowledge as a scholarly field in its own right is an astonishingly and surprisingly new phenomenon. It has emerged as an intellectual enterprise in the course of the last 15 years. In the English-speaking world, the history of knowledge was initially met with modest attention, and a unified direction of school couldn't be identified. Meanwhile, a methodologically and theoretically more sophisticated discussion took place in German-speaking Europe under the name of Wissensgeschichte. Since the mid-2010s, however, the propagation of the history of knowledge as a distinctive field seems to have entered a new and more international phase. Engagement has grown significantly in the Anglo-Saxon world, and one or many manifestations of this we can see here. That many publications are aimed at an international readership, and they have been introductory books. For example, Peter Berg's What is the History of Knowledge from 2016. There have been a series of programmatic articles. For example, Simone Lessig at the German Historical Institute in Washington, who has managed to turn history of knowledge into one of their profiles. There have also been older centers of history of science, history of knowledge. Max Planck in Berlin, Geschichte des Wissens in Zurich. More recent ones in Cambridge. And also a number of monographs and edited volumes. There are also two new journals. Journal for the History of Knowledge, which will be launched next year by a kind of Dutch-Belgium enterprise. And then the Chicago-based journal, which was released 2 years ago. Yes. So this is taken together. All these recent initiatives and activities contribute to give the history of knowledge a firmer institutional and intellectual foundation. We can see that there are many different reasons why historians and other scholars suddenly are drawn to the history of knowledge. For historians of medicine and science, for example, it offers a refashioning of traditional objects of inquiry. The widening of scope is similarly welcome for intellectual historians and historians of education. And for many historians, I think the history of knowledge is a response to a general call to revitalize the discipline and find something else after cultural history that has dominated so much the last decades. From another perspective, of course, the history of knowledge could be seen as a response or an invitation for academics to take an active part in some of the pressing issues of our time by providing historical knowledge, historical points of reference. In this respect, it has to be related to the large ongoing processes of our time, globalization, digitalization, and general change in the patterns of communication, movement, and interaction in the 21st century. However, the recent search of the history of knowledge as a self-proclaimed intellectual field may overshadow that there exist several parallel understandings of what it comprises or should comprise. And when surveying contemporary scholarship, I think I can discern at least 5 major understandings or 5 historiographical varieties, even though the overlappings between them sometimes are significant. The first one could be called an encyclopedic manifestation of the history of knowledge. It is distinguished by its all-embracing ambitions, although mainly focusing on the learned spheres and institutions. The best example of this form, I think, is Peter Berg's General Books of the History of Knowledge, published these 2 volumes in the early part of the 21st century, and then the second volume 2011. And he has also written other books. And of course, he's very well read in the cultural and intellectual history of the Western world, from Gutenberg to Wikipedia, as he has in his subtitles. But the theoretical considerations of what the history of knowledge might be are rare in these books. Instead, Berg rightly characterized his own works as a series of essays, impressionistic in its methods and provisional in its conclusions, as he writes. A second understanding of the history of knowledge could be found within the history of science. In this context, the history of knowledge offers a reformulation of traditional objects of study and challenges established narratives and concepts. For instance, Lauren Dustin has in several articles outlined the transformation of the history of science in recent decades, thanks to a global and practical turn its methodology has been substantially broadened and its objects of study more diversified. As a consequence, the history of science has distanced itself from the old theological meta-narrative of the rise of the Western science to the point that the more adequate label of the current practice would be history of knowledge, Dustin suggests. It has the advantage, this label, that it is not bound to a specific modern understanding of science. Instead, it could comprehend everything from indigenous Peruvian botany to the social sciences of the 1990s. But this is one discussion that is going on within this field. A third explication of the history of science, history of knowledge, is that its attraction as an intellectual field lies in its capacity to comprise other academic fields, other forms of academic knowledge than the ones that traditionally have been studied by historians of science, technology, or medicine. And I think the best example of this is the renewed interest in the history of the humanities. Rens Bod and his mainly Dutch colleagues have been very successful in introducing history of the humanities in this way as a more integrative history which goes beyond the study of individual disciplines. They have launched a new journal, History of Humanities, in 2016, and there they encouraged historians of the humanities to engage with history of science and ultimately write a combined history under the head of history of knowledge. Recently, Rens Bod also published a book in Dutch, which will be translated into English, a world full of patterns, which he sees as a history of knowledge, also combining history of social sciences, history of science, and history of humanities. So broadening the scope to include all academic fields. That could be one way of understanding the history of knowledge. Fourthly, we expand it even more to a history of all forms of knowledge. That's ambitious. And in this interpretation, it transgresses epistemic knowledge and proposes analysis of other forms of knowledge, other forms of knowledge, including tacit knowledge, practical knowledge, and indigenous knowledge. A broader repertoire of knowledge forms have been suggested in those two new periodicals that I mentioned before. In the new Dutch-Belgian one, Journal for the History of Knowledge, for instance, the editors state that it will be devoted to the history of knowledge in its broadest sense, including the study of science, but also of indigenous and other types of knowledge. And number 5, a fifth understanding of the history of knowledge stresses knowledge as a fundamental category in society. A common denominator here among those who emphasize the role and relevance of knowledge in society at large is that they have their background in the history of discipline, in the discipline of history, with its traditional focus on politics, social relations, and cultural phenomena. For example, Philip Sarrazin in Zurich, he proposes, for example, in a programmatic article, that German Wissensgeschichte should be about the societal production and circulation of knowledge. Societal production and circulation of knowledge. In another programmatic text, Simone Lessig in Washington, also a historian, discusses the field as a form of social and cultural history that examines knowledge as a phenomenon that touches on almost everything. It should be a history about knowledge in society and knowledge in culture, she argues. And this is one example of that. Migrant knowledge, also something which is very much linked to the research environment at the German Historical Institute in Washington, where they try to bring together two fields, migration history and history of knowledge. Well, these 5 understandings of history of knowledge outlined here are fairly vague. I understand that. And there are no sharp division lines between them. If anything, I think they illustrate that the history of knowledge can attract supporters from many different academic disciplines, but that the specific form of knowledge that is adopted is not least determined by the intellectual tradition that one is part of and would like to promote. And I think that is important when we think about various forms of the history of knowledge. So that was a kind of general historiographical overview of various forms of history of knowledge. In what follows, I will try to demonstrate how a new history of post-war humanities could be written as a part of a larger history of the post-war society. My approach in this sense my approach to the history of knowledge could be seen as a combination of understanding number 3, which was the way of writing a history of all academic fields, and of number 5, that is a history of knowledge in society. So I try to approach this by combining these 2 understandings. The history of humanities has been written for a very long time, and especially the history of the disciplines belonging to the humanities. This new journal, which I mentioned briefly, was or is a journal that was launched by the group based in the Netherlands around Rensbad. And this new journal, I think there have been some 6 or 7 issues so far. If you have a look at this journal, you can see that they have written the history of humanities in a new way, but perhaps not as innovative as you might think. I think it's fair to say that if you look at this journal, the main part of the articles fall into one of 3 fields or approaches. The first one is that they have written the history of the humanities as a history of disciplines, but with new concepts, many of them drawing from the history of science. For example, looking at scientific persona or scholarly practices. Another way, the second way, is that they have looked at different relations between the humanities on the one hand and other fields of academic knowledge. This debate about the 2 cultures, for example, they have contributed to that. And thirdly, they have put the humanities into a global perspective, comparing many of the concepts that are very Western to, for example, similar concepts in China or elsewhere. That has been the 3 main lines of inquiry or research within this journal. However, what I want to do is, as I mentioned before, to bring the humanities into a larger history of society, as a part of a larger history of knowledge of a society, of kind of public knowledge. And in this, I draw inspiration from theoretical and methodological discussions within the field of history of knowledge, which was mentioned here earlier. Not least the discussions about circulation of knowledge. And as Inanna mentioned before, this book, published last year, Circulation of Knowledge, offers some insights into that field, hopefully. And if you have an interest in that, it's also available open access through our webpage. And in the introduction there, we spell out some of the main or major discussions and major historiographical interpretations within this field. In this book, we discerned 3 different understandings of circulation of knowledge that so far are dominating the discussion. Firstly, there has been a kind of geographical understanding of circulation, which has been employed not least in the global history of science, when studying how knowledge travels over vast distances. A typical example of that is that you study medical knowledge and what happens with that when it travels from London or Edinburgh to the Indian subcontinent, to India. And what's happened with how is knowledge transformed when it travels over vast distances. That has been one way that circulation of knowledge has been employed. Secondly, in the history of popular science, there is a kind of social circulation of knowledge, which has emerged as an alternative to the unidirectional model of disseminating knowledge to passive audiences. And finally, there is a material understanding, seen in many studies, some of them inspired by Bruno Latour, of how the movement of objects transfigures and underpins knowledge. A common denominator here is that scholars use circulation of knowledge to renounce diffusionist models. However, there have been very few conscious attempts to clarify what the concept means, and the discussions have been disjointed. For that reason, Kapil Raj has characterized circulation as a recurrent, though non-theorized concept. Similarly, Jim Secord here in Cambridge has said that it runs the risk of becoming a meaningless buzzword. Circulation of knowledge is therefore, I think, in need of both clarification and theorization. And in a new research program, which I have started or launched earlier this year, I will, together with two postdoctoral fellows, try to introduce a new concept, societal circulation of knowledge, and try to see what that could mean when we study the humanities. Societal circulation of knowledge. Well, what does that mean? It means, I think, that knowledge should be studied as a public phenomenon. Analysis of societal circulation begin with the assumption that knowledge should be studied as a public phenomenon. The societal reach and societal relevance of knowledge constitute the core analysis, not the production of knowledge. This means also that we will focus on public arenas of knowledge and actors of knowledge in this project. And here, more precisely, is our project. We call it, this part of the project, Humanities in Motion, and circulation of knowledge in post-war Sweden and West Germany. It runs for 2 years, and Anton Jansson and Ragnhild Svensson are together with me in this project. A key concept for us will be this public arenas of knowledge. And what does that mean? Well, it means a way of trying to find something that is somewhat more concrete than circulation of knowledge in more general terms. We see public arenas of knowledge as a kind of forum for circulation of knowledge, as a kind of meeting place or place for actors, certain kind of actors of knowledge and certain kind of audiences where they could meet. We also say that public arenas of knowledge, that something that is necessary is a certain amount of stability. It also has its own rhetorical norms, which defines what could be said there, what kind of knowledge could circulate. And we see this also as a part of a larger infrastructure of knowledge. And this is, of course, a big separate discussion which we also have to take into account. The concept of public, or the public sphere, or public arenas, that is, of course, also a very big discussion in history, in sociology, and other fields. And it's a complicated notion in scholarship and historiography, and we have to bear that in mind, that we need to, of course, historize that concept, and we also have to see that there are not the public sphere in the singular, but there are many overlapping types of spheres, public spheres. And that is also true for public arenas of knowledge. Well, this is a kind of general, perhaps theoretical point of departure. We will see how it will work when we turn into our historical investigations. And I will give you some examples of how we will work with that. Yes, here we have a reminder of the project again. What I will do in this project is to focus on Sweden and West Germany during this period. And that is true for my two colleagues in the project. Many of the existing studies of circulation are devoted to the natural sciences in the English-speaking world of the 19th century. By contrast, we will focus on comparative analysis of public circulation of humanistic knowledge in Sweden and the Federal Republic of Germany, mainly in the 1960s and 70s. And for my part, I will study mainly mass media, different kind of circulation of knowledge in mass media, and regard some parts of the press and some parts of the early television as public knowledge arenas of knowledge. This example, for example, is from a Swedish paper. It's a daily essay page, which has been published in the second largest Swedish daily from 1918 and onwards, and it's still published, 101 years old. So every day a scholar or a journalist or a writer writes an essay, and I have studied that for the 1960s. The name comes originally from a French tradition, but the name is under the line, understrecket, which meant originally that under this line it was a free area, a free arena where the scholar, the scientist, the journalist, the writer could write about everything they wanted. And it was very much about academic or scholarly issues. And I looked at this from the 1960s, and if it was some 350 articles, 1/10 of the total number of articles which I looked into. And if I did that, I could see that it was many of the articles, 55%, were about the humanities. So it was very many articles about philosophy, literature, archaeology, architecture during the 1960s, a period which is often described as a decline of the humanities in a kind of public consciousness, where the natural sciences and the social sciences won and became more and more important. And that is of course true in many ways. And if you look at a major Swedish daily, and I will compare that with German counterparts later on, we could see that scholars from very traditional academic fields of the humanities still had a very strong position in the public sphere during this period. I will also look at something which was very popular in Sweden during the 1960s. It was modeled on actually a BBC program, a kind of talking head program. It's called Ask Lund, Fråga Lund, which meant that people could write into this program, and then a couple of students in the middle there could ask questions to 6 professors sitting there. And this was very popular in the 1960s. And I know that there have been equivalent or more or less equivalent programs in other countries. What is interesting here, and you can study that, is that the 6 professors sitting here representing knowledge, representing academia, representing research and scholarship, 3 of them came from a very traditional academic humanities background: ethnology, classics and history. And then we have biology, physics and medicine on the other side. The social sciences or technology, for example, those feel that in other discourses, in other understandings of the 1960s were very popular or very important for the formation of a kind of academic field during this period. They didn't have representatives during this shows during the 1960s. So looking at this program and other similar programs in radio and broadcasting television during the 1960s, I could see that the humanities had a very strong position as a field of knowledge, and this reached millions of people during this period, peak period. And they very much represented also an old or somewhat older tradition of learning during this period, but they still went on and were here. Something completely different, belonging to the same period, will be studied by one of my colleagues. She has a background as a historian of the book, and she will look at these paperback series, very popular in the 1960s. It started in America and Britain, of course, earlier than that, but from the late 50s onwards, in West Germany and Sweden, they became very popular as an arena of knowledge, as something that's disseminated, or contributed to the circulation of academic knowledge, mainly in the humanities and social sciences, but also in the natural sciences. This is from the German one, Rowohls Deutsche Enzyklopädie, but there were similar ones in other countries, in other languages. And some of these, for example in sociology or philosophy or history, they were written by many of the leading scholars of the time, and many of them sold amazingly numbers of copies, hundreds of thousands of copies. And they were read and discussed, and this will be studied also as an important arena of knowledge during the 1960s. Another arena, a physical arena, is the new bookstores that belonged very much to the New Left in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that will be also the second part of my colleague Ragnhild Svensson's investigation within this project. She will study this international bookstores, but also popular in West Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, were the so-called book cafes. I don't know if they existed in Britain very much, as part of a kind of left-wing culture, where it was not only a bookstore, but also a production site, a site where books were made, journals were made, and also distributed. So it was also a physical site for the circulation and production of knowledge, very much bringing in academic knowledge from the social sciences and the humanities and promoting it as something that was important or seemed to be important for the political development of this country in this context. So it's a new way, a new part of the public sphere, partly challenging the old traditional one, but at the same time also a part of a larger ecology. My second colleague, Anton Jansson, he will look at something that is partly, I would say, forgotten when writing the history of post-war humanities, and that is the Christian part, the Christian publishing houses, the Christian churches, or churches as physical places, but the Christian journals, very important, both in a secularized country like Sweden, but also in West Germany. And that was also something that was part of a vibrant intellectual community during this period, where the humanities, and also drawing from theology, became part of a larger discussion during this period. So you will look into the churches, the Christian journals, the Christian publishing houses, and how they were a kind of arena for knowledge during this period, in between different spheres. Perhaps we will add other case studies. We have just started, we haven't decided that yet, But this is examples of how we will work. So what are the conclusions here, coming to an end? Well, it's too early to say that, I think. We have just started. But a few arguments, at least. The first one is that by focusing on public arenas of knowledge, I think we could bring in new actors of knowledge into the discussion. Not only male professors at the large university, but also publishers, newspaper editors, translators, as I mentioned before, other kind of arenas, this left-wing book cafes, the Christian journals, for example, expanding the ecosystem. A second argument is that we could also bring in new contact soon. The history of humanities is not only a history of the relationship between the humanities on the one hand and the social sciences or natural sciences on the other hand. It's also a history of the humanities and its relations with, for example, the school system or the churches or other spheres of society. Thirdly, I hope we could, and this is really our point of departure, write a more integrative history of the humanities, integrating the humanities into a larger history of society, and thereby contributing also to a larger history of post-war knowledge. By doing this, I also think we could challenge a kind of very established crisis narrative of the humanities, which you can find in many overviews, but also in autobiographical accounts, where the 1950s, the 1960s marks really the start of the decline of the humanities, and where the social sciences, that is really the big decade of the social sciences starting in the 1960s. In some way, that is undoubtedly true. If you look at where the students went, and if you look at resources, for example, also. But if you look at the public sphere, different public arenas of knowledge, you can see that it was a large interest in many of the traditional fields of the humanities. And I've given some examples of that. So it very much depends on what you are focusing on and what you are looking at. And by doing that, I also hope that we could contribute with a new assessment of the value and relevance of the humanities. Seeing that the humanities have played and still continue to play an important role in many parts of the society, but we have to look at this and see it as a part, as a contribution coming from the humanities as an academic field. And finally, of course, on a more overarching level, we hope that we could put our increasingly digital media landscape in perspective by looking at this pre-digital world of the 1960s and 70s and compare them with each other. I think that was my 42 minutes. And I end there. So I hope I have given you some ideas about how I look at the history of knowledge in a more general sense, but also this new project which we will be working on for 2 years, starting now. Thank you very much for your attention.